Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and if at first you don't succeed, try again. We now have a new Speaker of the House. Kevin McCarthy has secured enough votes to gather a victory. It happened on Friday night. We'll see what the Republican agenda is, but this was a hard-fought victory for Kevin McCarthy, and he had to give up a lot in order to get the speakership. This is going to be one of the weakest speakers in the last several decades. There is zero doubt about that, because Republicans held him accountable. They held his feet to the fire. You had conservatives that did want some concessions to be made, and Kevin McCarthy has made those concessions. So there are some good concessions that were made, and when I say good concessions, I'm talking about budgeting process and oversight and rules committee and actually having floor debate, getting back to regular order, having time to read bills before you actually have to vote on them. These are all good things that we should praise. The one compromise that I don't think he should have made was the whole idea of him being challenged as speaker going forward, where it only takes a single person to declare a motion and a vote of no confidence to trigger another election for the speakership. And the reason I don't like this is because Kevin McCarthy's the speaker for the entire House of Representatives. He's not just the speaker for the Republican Party. And when you do something like this, it effectively weakens the speaker, where anyone could challenge him. And if you don't get 218 votes the next time to cross the threshold, then we go through this cycle again. I think this kind of neuters Kevin McCarthy to a large degree. And even Democrats can now use this in order to effectively target McCarthy and create chaos in the House of Representatives. So I'm not crazy about that, but hopefully we now have a Congress that actually adheres to the idea of limited government, that actually adheres to the idea of debate and discourse, that preserves the United States Constitution, holds the Constitution up as something to be valued and a guide that we should follow rather than just constantly dismissing it. But I'm not going to harp on it too long because I have Miranda Devine coming in. She is back. She has a phenomenal book, Laptop from Hell, and we have to look at Miranda Devine's reporting, and her book really exposed the corruption within our institutions, the corruption within the entire system. And I don't even know if Miranda realized how important her work was when she was writing it. I mean, sure, you're talking about a family of the person that wanted to become president being thoroughly corrupt, but because they censored Miranda Devine, and because they censored the New York Post, we are now learning about the massive abuse of power at the hands of our government. A lot of people are calling it censorship, but it goes far beyond censorship. This is institutional corruption, and this is a clear abuse of power. It's a violation of the mission statements of these agencies, and they ruin the trust that the American people placed in them. They all need to be held accountable. We have to begin to talk about downsizing government, returning power back to the people, because obviously the officials that are in charge can't be trusted with this power. So I want to talk to Miranda Devine about her work, about the Twitter files, everything that's going on. Before I do, make sure you check out PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Also follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you find the show informative, make sure to share it with your family and friends. With that out of the way, I want to bring in Miranda Devine, author of Laptop from Hell. Miranda, I always love our conversations. How are you today?
Yep, fantastic to see you, Nicholas.
It's always good to see you. And since we last spoke, obviously, there's been a lot out there. And you're part of the firestorm that's breaking out. You know, when we look at the Twitter files, realistically, if it wasn't for you, we'd probably never know any of this. If it wasn't for your report about the Biden laptop and what the Biden family was doing, nobody would know the censorship that went on at Twitter. But I think the bigger deal is the government involvement in Twitter. So what's your take on what the government was doing? Not just Twitter trying to censor posts and kick Donald Trump off or anything like that, but what the government was actually doing to put their hands on the scale.
Well, really, I mean, the government was the hidden hand behind all this censorship. It was the FBI. And, what makes this even more sinister is that the FBI had in their possession the laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop. They'd had it since December 2019 when the computer repair shop owner, John Paul McIsaac, gave it to them. hoping that they would do something with it because he had looked at it and he had decided after almost a year of having a look at the files on there about Ukraine and payments going to the Biden family from overseas, and there's millions of dollars in their receipts on the laptop. He'd looked at all that and he decided that this was a problem and that he needed to get into the hands of authorities, and then nothing happened. There was no action from the FBI, as we now know from whistleblowers within the FBI who've come forward. That was because there were specific people in the Washington field office who deliberately suppressed the laptop and ensured that there was going to be no investigation into it. And so, and not only the laptop, they also suppressed the 5-hour interview that Tony Bobulinski, one of Hunter Biden's former business partners, gave. He was a whistleblower. He also was concerned about Joe Biden and his relationship with China. And also he handed over the contents of 3 of his phones, and that material on that it corroborated, duplicated, buttressed the material on the laptop. So it was a slam dunk case for the FBI, except that there were the Washington field office at the very least was suppressing and making sure that this material would not see the light of day, at least before the 2020 election. And so at the same time, the FBI was spying on Rudy Giuliani since about a month after he became President Trump's personal lawyer. They had a covert surveillance warrant on his cloud, which meant that they could look at his emails and his iMessages. And I mean, presumably that's what they did, because why get the warrant? Subsequently, the warrant they took out was on a very bogus charge. It was FARA violations, Foreign Agent Registration Act violations alleged. And, this year they just dropped, they raided his house, they raided his apartment, they raided his office after the election. And then a year later, they just dropped the case, no charges, and gave him back all his devices. So
and the one sentence statement.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that statement only came out because Rudy Giuliani's lawyer, Bob Costello, asked for them to make a statement to clear Rudy Giuliani's name, because he has this, he's had an FBI raid, he's had this covert surveillance warrant. There's, his reputation is harmed by that. So anyway, they on what looks like now a very flimsy pretext, they spied on him for over 2 years, and they therefore they would have had access to the email that came through on August 27, 2020 from John Paul MacIsaac telling Rudy Giuliani about this laptop that Hunter Biden had abandoned at his store, and all the incriminating material on there of corruption by Joe Biden. And what he was concerned about in particular was the Ukraine corruption and the sort of compromise that one of the candidates for president was under. So they would have seen that. And then they also would have seen on October 10, well, I don't know if they would have seen it. I can't say for sure. They had access to it, but I don't know whether they saw it, if they were being lazy, if they looked at every single email and iMessage that went through to Rudy Giuliani. But all I can tell you is that they would have had access to my conversations on text. Most of them were phone conversations, but with Rudy Giuliani. And on October 10, I said, hold off, don't give the story to anyone else. It's going to work out for us. And then we had a bit of a to and fro over the next couple of days. And I said, it's a great story. And so they'd be on the lookout for something, presumably, and that would have given them a bit of a clue that the Post was going to publish the story. And that was 3 weeks before the election. It was exactly what they didn't want to happen. So I'm interested in knowing, was it then that they got together with those 51 former intelligence operatives who wrote that letter about 5 days after our story came out on October 14. So October 19, 2020, they made public through Politico a letter that they wrote saying that the Hunter Biden laptop and our reporting had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. In other words, it was Russian disinformation, pay no attention to it. And a couple of days after the letter, Joe Biden had to go into that final debate against Donald Trump, where this bombshell was obviously going to come up because Donald Trump brought it up. And Joe Biden used that letter to get off the hook. He said, hey, the intelligence community's 50 very eminent former CIA directors are saying what you're saying is garbage, and that was just a Russian plant. And that was it. The story disappeared. You had Facebook and Twitter within hours of our publishing had censored our story. That was enough of a kind of a signal to liberals, to half the country, to ignore this story that it's just garbage, it's Russian disinformation. And then they had what they thought was credible evidence of that from this letter from, these 51 former intelligence officials, which included 5 former CIA directors or acting CIA directors, people like John Brennan, Leon Panetta, Michael Hayden, NSA Director James Clapper, pretty high-ranking intelligence officials who shamefully, they will go to their graves with this as a great stain on their reputations, that they signed that letter having no evidence, having not even asked to see a copy of the laptop, copy of the hard drive. They didn't ask to see the emails that we had verified. They didn't even ask us, how we verified what we did. They didn't contact Tony Bobolinsky. They didn't do any of the due diligence that was perfectly able to be done in the 5 days between our story coming out and they're publishing their letter. And I think, 5 days is a pretty short time to get 51 people corralled to agree to a form of words, especially in such a controversial circumstance right before a presidential election. So I'm wondering if maybe whoever at the FBI was listening in on Rudy Giuliani or spying on Rudy Giuliani's cloud got wind that, from my text messages with Rudy that the Post was about to publish, and they kind of pre-bunked it by getting this letter together, So who knows? All we know is that the FBI was involved. The FBI was behind the scenes talking to Twitter and Facebook. We know that from Mark Zuckerberg. And we also know now from the Twitter files that the FBI had their man embedded in Twitter 5 months before the presidential election. James Baker, the former top lawyer at the FBI, who was central to the whole Russia collusion lies about Donald Trump, who was involved in the Alpha Bank hoax, who was involved in the Steele dossier, who actually was a very good friend of James Comey and wrote the pre-exoneration letter of Hillary Clinton. So this guy is up to his eyeballs in political dirty tricks, and he gets parachuted into Twitter 5 months before the election to serve as Twitter's deputy general counsel.
Such a coincidence, right?
Such a coincidence. And he was involved in the discussions that morning or after our story came back to urge the rest of people at Twitter not, to block our story because you just don't know if it's hacked material. That's what he said.
Yeah. Meanwhile, he knew damn well it wasn't hacked material. He still has colleagues at the FBI that he could just pick up the phone and ask if it is hacked material. So, well, but I think it's the timeline that really concerns me here because this didn't all happen in October. And so you rightly state that Giuliani was under investigation prior to this. So it's already concerning that you have the FBI investigating a president's lawyer. That's a concern of number one. But even more concerning is we know now that the FBI was actually meeting with Facebook and Twitter long before August of 2020. They were warning that, hey, disinformation may come out. We have to be on the alert. It's an election year. Now, I don't know if it was specific to Hunter Biden at that point, but by the time that you got the laptop, it's almost as if they already knew that this was all coming out. It's almost as if they already had it organized of how they were going to try and debunk this. And I think that's the thing that concerns me is how did they have so much information? Now, we know for the last 20 years, If you look at what has happened to certain journalists, whether it's, James Rosen or Judith Miller, they were monitored and they were being listened in on. Are you aware if you were being monitored at all, if you were being listened in on? Have you filed any type of Freedom of Information Act to try and find out if they were almost surveilling you without any pretext or warrants or anything like that? We know that's happened to plenty of journalists in the last 4 administrations, so it wouldn't shock me if it was.
No, it wouldn't shock me either. I don't know, but I guess I conduct myself as far as I am able in a way that, it doesn't matter if people listen in on me. And now we do a lot of conversations on encrypted messaging apps and so on. I mean, hardly anybody I talk to about anything sensitive do we do it in sort of normal text messages anymore. Back in October 2020, I guess, even then, when I was talking to Rudy Giuliani, it was always on phone, or Bob Costello. We didn't really do much by email or text. And in fact, Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump, they have laughed about the fact that, the FBI was, Rudy Giuliani thinks they spied on him to spy on Trump, and they just cooked up a pretext with the FARA violations. And but they laugh because Donald Trump never commits anything to a text. Like he doesn't text at all much, and his communications are phone calls or through other people, word like person to person. So they didn't get much, is what Rudy was saying. So I think a lot of people who are savvy have lived their life as if they're being spied on, which sounds paranoid, but it's not anymore.
No, it's not. I mean, as I stated, I mean, they were months in advance of the story actually coming out, already setting up warnings, and there is zero doubt. It's indisputable that they actually manipulated an election. I mean, we actually have the most powerful law enforcement agency in the entire country, perhaps the world, getting directly involved in an election, not for the first time. This was the second time in 2 straight consequential elections that they got involved and tipped their hand. But I want to talk more about this when we get back. So we're going to take a quick break. But when we get back, I want to explore how there was a very troubling court case that many didn't pick up on. And I want to get your thoughts on it. So we'll be right back. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get yours today. It's not just the FBI. So a few months before the Twitter files even broke, there was a court case that most people didn't even pay attention to. But it was revealed that Carol Crawford of the CDC had this pipeline to Twitter where she would talk about, and I'm using her words, these aren't my words and me putting words in her mouth, unapproved opinions need to be shut down. Unapproved opinions. Have you ever heard of a government bureaucrat use the phrase unapproved opinions, and how frightening is that, both as an American and as a journalist?
Well, it's unbelievable, isn't it? That, the home of the First Amendment, the freest country on the planet, would have a government bureaucrat talk to a social media company about unapproved opinions that she wanted shut down and successfully got shut down. I mean, it's Orwellian, that word's overused, but I can't think of any other to you. I mean, this is sheer authoritarianism, and that is what has happened with these social media companies. Big tech all over. It's Google as well. It's Facebook. It's Twitter. It's also Reddit and YouTube, Wikipedia. There were about 7 different big tech companies that the FBI was meeting with every week before the election. So all those platforms are important. And if you have a stranglehold on those, you have a stranglehold on the entire conversation. You are controlling the thoughts of Americans. And it's not just people who are on social media. You know, you might say, oh, I don't use any of those platforms. Well, you kind of do, because if you consume any media, if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, any media, like every newsroom in the country is influenced by Google search. You know,
they handle 90% of all searches. 90%.
Yeah. So, you know, I find myself, I'm writing stories about the laptop and looking for stories I wrote 2 years ago, and I can't find them on Google. Like, it is very difficult. I have to put very specific search terms in to be able to find them. I will find stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and The Hill and Politico debunking my stories, but you know, saying
attempting
that Joe
to
Biden's
debunk.
Innocent. Yeah. But I can't find my actual stories. And the New York Post stories that we broke the laptop story, and we've ever since then been breaking stories and have led the pack on the Biden corruption and the cover-up. And yet, when you look at Google, it's very difficult. I remember I was looking for a story. It was on page 14 of Google. And so it's all of big tech. And this is the sort of dystopian science fiction future that Orwell and other science fiction writers would talk about. You know, I mean, anyone who likes science fiction recognizes what we're living through right at the moment, and it just sort of crept up on us. I don't know when. I mean, it seems like it all came to the fore after Donald Trump was elected, but clearly the apparatus was in place before then. And, you know, like if you look at Twitter and Facebook and Google, and you just do a cursory LinkedIn search, and there are so many former FBI and former CIA operatives working at those companies. And you sort of say, well, maybe that's normal because, you know, if you're going to have cybersecurity, maybe you're going to hire former, you know, people in that space, and FBI, CIA makes sense. But on the other hand, there's so many of them, and some of them don't work in the cybersecurity space. They're all over the place. So what is so attractive to ex-FBI and CIA agents in the social media companies? Well, I just think that they have become a hotbed of spies, not just American spies, but foreign spies. There's been some reporting about that. And for whatever reason, those people decided that they didn't want Donald Trump to win the 2020 election, so they were going to put their thumb on the scale. And one of the ways they did that was by anticipating our story that was going to come out on October 14, 2020, and going to Facebook and Twitter and probably the other platforms and pre-bunking our story. So we know from Yoel Roth, who was the head of site integrity at Twitter, who left when Elon Musk came on board, but back in 2020, that was his job, and he met weekly with the FBI, and he wrote in a sworn statement in December of 2020 to the FEC that the FBI had told him that they were anticipating a hack and leak operation, probably in October, probably relating to Hunter Biden.
To me, I think that when you look at Google, so I think they're one of the most concerning actually that exists out there. When it comes to Google, I do tons of research given the nature of my position. I'll be looking for a source that I know exists, that, you know, a PDF that I know exists on there, giving me numbers for a certain subject, and I can't find it on Google. I'll jump to different search engines and I'll search and I'll be able to find it. And it really is amazing. And I encourage everyone to try that. When you're searching for something on Google, then search it in Yahoo and DuckDuckGo and all the different other search engines that exist. You get a bunch of different results. But one of the things, again, I go with the timelines that concerns me. So you and I have spoken about the national strategy before. The Biden administration issued the national strategy in June of 2021. And if you look at Pillar 1 of the national strategy, it talks about creating a partnership with private companies. Essentially, the private companies serve as the eyes and ears for the government And if you look at pillar 2 of combating domestic terrorism, or what they deem domestic terrorism, it's controlling the flow of information. It talks about affecting the supply and demand of recruitment materials online, which essentially is censorship and monitoring censorship and controlling the flow of information out there. Now, this strategy was released in June of 2021. But if you look at what Twitter, Facebook, and the FBI were doing, it all lines up to the pillars. And so it tells me that this strategy was being built out long before the Biden administration. Did President Trump actually have control over the federal bureaucracy, or was the federal bureaucracy working? I mean, obviously they were undermining, and we all know that. But this has been in the process of being built out over a period of time, and there are many, both Republican and Democrat. You have a Harvard professor, I can't recall the name, and a University of Arizona professor that wrote an article for The Atlantic talking about how China mostly got it right when it comes to internet censorship, and the United States has gotten it wrong. Yeah. And so you see these government officials that are constantly talking about censorship and monitoring in the age of the internet. They have a firm control over big tech. Yeah, they do. And I mean, Google is really just a gigantic surveillance platform. It knows where we are and what we buy and what we spend and what our political beliefs are. And it sells that information for billions of dollars. We're the products that they're selling. And they're spying on us, that they know what you've been talking about. If you're talking about you want to, go on a yacht in Greece or something, then suddenly those travel ads will pop up for yachts in Greece. So Siri or whatever it is constantly listening to you on your phone, even if the phone's off. So all that stuff, you sort of, I feel like a paranoid conspiracy theorist even saying this. 2 years ago, it would have just seemed like that. But now we have seen, and I think our eyes have been opened to the really sinister nature of this technology. And, we're talking about the sort of the melding of the federal government and big tech into this really ferocious tool for control. And it's every bit as authoritarian as what we're seeing in China. And you mentioned that this Harvard professor's writing that China got it right. And it was Jack Goldsmith and Andrew Woods that actually wrote it. And the quote, and the direct quote is, in the great debate of the past 2 decades about freedom versus control of the network, China was largely right and the United States was largely wrong. Significant monitoring and speech controls are inevitable components of a mature and flourishing internet, and governments must play a large role in such practices to ensure the internet is compatible with social norms and values. Unbelievable. Isn't it? That was Jack Goldsmith and Andrew Woods. I'll send you the link. It's an Atlantic article. And then you had Richard Stengel, who was a former Obama administration official. He called the idea of freedom of speech a design flaw. So this is what we're up against. And now, and this is something that you're very familiar with. You have a report, you guys reported it at the Post, that there's a bunch of Hunter Biden allies that now want to go on the offensive, engage in character assassination against people like Tony Bobulinski and against people like yourself, that they want to destroy the characters of anyone that dares to expose the Biden family corruption and what the big guy was getting. Yeah. Well, look, it's fascinating that, remember, during the pandemic, you had people like Anthony Fauci point to China as a model, the lockdowns, the nailing people into their apartments so they could burn to death. That was a model. Crazy. So, I'm just flabbergasted that Harvard professors could write that in the Atlantic and that they wouldn't be immediately struck off and cancelled. How outrageous. Got completely ignored. Completely ignored. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you picked it up. Gosh, that's a... Well, and you know what the scary part is? There are so many examples like this out there. That's the scary part of officials saying that thing. I mean, you rightly said, you had Fauci praising China's response to the coronavirus, the zero COVID strategies. They would have loved to have imported that here. And it's like, they don't even hear themselves. They don't even see how authoritarian they are. Instead, they say, that people like myself are a threat to democracy because I talk about the Constitution and government power and abuse. And they'll say that we're threats to democracy. That's the insane world we're living in.
Well, look, it comes maybe back down to money. And, I often wonder why this extreme obsession with Russia, turning Russia into the bogeyman. I mean, it successfully caused a war, you could say, but by backing Russia into a corner, and so that they turn like a cornered rat and invade Ukraine. So I think that the whole Russia obsession that we've had hammered down our throat, this deliberate attempt to kind of make Russia into the bogeyman, when Russia is, a malign place, but it's a small country. It's really not the threat at all that China is. China is the existential threat. China is coming after us deliberately. China is aggressing on America and its allies. And America's done nothing about it, particularly Joe Biden has done nothing about it. That's what, from his very earliest days, he's been just a puppet of the Chinese. When he was a young senator, he went off and got duchessed at the equivalent of Martha's Vineyard by all the top CCP officials, and came back and was so extravagant in his praise of China that the Weekly Standard wrote excoriating him and saying what an embarrassment he was. Joe Biden, as senator, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, he was instrumental in getting his colleagues to sign on to allowing China into the WTO in 2001, which had a radical impact on American manufacturing, on the American middle class.
And they're still classified as a developing country in the WTO. So if they were a first world country, the rules would be a lot different, but they're still classified as a developing country, even though they're not.
And that's right. They cheat all the time. That's just what they do. They cheat and they laugh at us. But a lot of people in America got rich through that, and are still getting rich from China. And so if you remember, there was a Professor Dong, I remember his first name, he gave a speech just after the 2020 election I think it was in Beijing. And it was translated and spread around YouTube until the person who translated it got banned, the speech got taken down. What that speech said was that he was sort of cock-a-hoop about the result of the election. And he was saying, well, we have our friends in America, the elites of China and the elites of America, and we have our friends on Wall Street, and Wall Street couldn't fix Trump. Yeah. So that was the problem.
Well, just look at the companies. The second Russia invaded Ukraine, all the companies announced we're pulling out of Russia, we're stopping operations, and fine. They could do what they want as far as corporations go, but it shows their hypocrisy and what frauds they are when they're sitting there talking about stopping doing business with Russia. Yet China, you have a genocide going on against the Uyghurs. They're persecuting Christians. And now with the protests going on in China, they're targeting the protesters. So it shows you that they're frauds. And I'm working on a piece now for Campus Reform where, the Chinese intelligence apparatus is second to none in the world. I mean, the intelligence apparatus that they build out is extraordinarily impressive. And how they infiltrated college campuses throughout the years is astonishing. And unfortunately, nobody really pays attention to it. People heard about Confucius Institutes, but they haven't heard about how Chinese intelligence sends their students here, quote unquote students. Many of them have ties directly to the PLA. Many of them are operating to recruit assets, to recruit spies here in the United States. There's an enormous amount of money being contributed to the colleges and universities. And it's not like these countries are contributing this money out of the kindness of their hearts. Obviously, they're doing it for a reason. And yet, when it comes to China, nothing. They don't say a peep.
Even attempts, which are bipartisan, to ban TikTok. And this has been going on since Trump was president and never got it done. Now it's being talked about again. And there are all these hit pieces being written about, Republicans, being paranoid and they want to get rid of TikTok. I know someone intelligence guy, who says that TikTok is the perfect surveillance tool, and they're getting voice prints and face prints of Americans and all sorts of other data that can be used specifically to target a weapon. So why we would, and we know that TikTok is controlled by China.
And I just want to take it a step further with that, because what you just said is important. And right now they're talking about banning it on government phones. But if you have, let's say, someone working for a Northrop Grumman or a Raytheon or something, and their child has TikTok on their phone, that phone's in that household. That phone can now pick up conversations. That phone could gain access to the iTunes account, because normally parents tie the iTunes account to their accounts. And what people don't realize is, you go back 7-8 years, it was China who hacked into the Office of Personnel Management. They got the names of all the people with security clearances. They got that information. I'm still have like another 8 years of credit monitoring and protection because I had a top secret security clearance. China got that information in this hack. And then it was a few months later, and Experian got hacked and all that data was breached by China. And so it doesn't take a lot to find people in very sensitive positions, match up with their credit reports and see who's in financial debts, who's not, and then try and blackmail in order to get assets, try and coerce people to give information to the Chinese government. And that's the sophistication we're dealing with that most of our politicians just completely ignore, don't even talk about it. I mean, the only one that I really hear going after China a lot is Senator Rubio does a lot.
Yes.
But most others remain silent.
Yeah. Well, I don't really understand why. All I can think is that obviously it's money. Obviously, after the pandemic, you would have thought that there would have been a real move to pull manufacturing out of China, or at least ensure that we weren't beholden to China for crucial goods like antibiotics. But there doesn't seem to have been much movement on that at all. And then you come down to the whole origins of COVID at the Wuhan lab.
Oh, stop it. It was a wet market from people eating bats. It wasn't the Wuhan lab. It wasn't the animal disease center that's a couple of miles away. It was in a wet market.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the fact that Anthony Fauci was so intent on diverting people's attention from the Wuhan lab and, helped orchestrate that Lancet letter that turned out to be so dishonest. Again, sort of like the Hunter Biden laptop, you can tell a lot from the cover-up, from who's doing the cover-up and why they're doing it and how effective they are. And there was definitely a cover-up about the Wuhan lab. And I'm still staggered, so long afterwards that the American government has not insisted on getting to the bottom of how that pandemic started. And it's almost like turn a blind eye, say a few words and really don't try. And so what does that tell you? That tells you that they don't want to see what it is because they already know. And they know because the Wuhan lab, if that was the center of it, if that's where the virus leaked from, as a lot of the evidence seems to point to that, then Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak from EcoHealth, who were, EcoHealth, this crappy little company that doesn't do any of its own research. It's got a little building on 9th Avenue. The guy who runs it, Peter Daszak, is this English guy, not an impressive guy, doesn't do research of his own. Somehow he gets to be at the center of this, getting tens of millions of dollars of federal money from the Department of Defense, and he funnels money to Wuhan to do this gain-of-function research on bat viruses. And he's a pal of Anthony Fauci, and Anthony Fauci gives him grants. Well, if that's not a story that needs investigating, I don't know what is.
It also shows how the government thinks that the American people are dumb, and maybe we are. I mean, not for nothing, but if an animal disease breaks out on Long Island, where I'm from, the first place I'm going to look is Plum Island Animal Disease Center. That's right off the coast of Orient Point. That's the first place I'm going to look. I'm not going to look in any grocery stores or wet markets. And it's just common sense. You don't need to be an intelligence genius or a person with brains to figure out, hey, if we got this animal virus disease center that's working on COVID strains in Wuhan, that's going to be the first place you look. But it shows how they have no regard for the American people anymore and that we need accountability in the system.
Well, they don't need to have regard because they now have control of the information sources.
Good point.
So it doesn't matter. They can gaslight you because you read in the New York Times that Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation, and you'll read that the Wuhan lab story is a right-wing conspiracy theory, and you'll believe it. And I look at, for instance, how the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are, we'll say the New York Times, the most influential newspaper in the world, and it sets the agenda for newsrooms across the English-speaking world. And so if you wanted to control what people think around the world, you would want to get control of the New York Times. Well, how would you do that? Well, they have a huge subscriber base of 6.3 million people. Who are those subscribers? Who's bulk bought subscriptions? Because now that the entire media industry got completely thrown asunder because of the internet, and if you're in a newspaper, all your sources of revenue, the streams of rivers of gold of advertising dried up, and so subscriptions became the model. And the New York Times has been very profitable because it has such a large subscription base. But that means that the editors and the writers now are guided by what their subscribers want. That's how you see the New York Times going further and further left.
But if there's an investigation into it, would we find that a lot of those subscriptions are actually being paid for by foreign governments?
Yes.
That's something that should be looked into.
It is something that should be looked into. And apparently there is some Republicans are looking into something along those lines next year, not specifically the New York Times, but something about subscription bases being turned into foreign influence operations. And I would argue not just foreign, domestic, because now that domestic terrorists are conservatives, according to the Biden administration, you're seeing the entire security apparatus focus inward and use the Patriot Act and other sort of, laws or legal weapons that were used against, extremist Islamists after 9/11. They're now being used on American citizens.
And that's why I always encourage people to go to the Post, because you don't have to pay for the Post. You could go online and actually read everything for free. Right. And that's the beauty of it. And you also are now doing a newsletter. So we're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report. Miranda, always informative and always happy to have you on, because it's a breath of fresh air from all the crap that's out there.
You too. Always fantastic to talk to you, Nicholas. Always learn something.
Always enjoy my conversations with Miranda. You got to check out Laptop from Hell. If you haven't read it already, make sure to read it. I have the links up at the P.A.S. report. Give her a follow. Make sure to check out her columns in the New York Post. Always writes interesting articles with a great analysis. It's usually spot on. It's always spot on. What am I saying? As for Wednesday's episode, I'm working on a great episode, and it's going to focus mostly on something that I'm seeing in our society that I think is a real problem that we need to discuss, particularly amongst the younger Americans. As someone who's been in the classroom for 17 years, there are a lot of troubling trends that we've been witnessing over the last decade. So I'll talk about that more on Wednesday. Don't forget to check out 4Patriots, the number 4patriots.com. You get 10% off your order using code PAS, so check it out. I hope you found the content of this podcast informative. If you did, please share it with your friends and family and on social media. Also, please leave the P.A.S. Report podcast 5-star rating on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.